Hello dear viewers, support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it, and also make sure you comment your thoughts. Now let's start the video. The slaver caravan stretched across the dusty plain like a serpent of human misery, its wagons creaking under the weight of their cargo of flesh and despair. Jon Snow crouched behind a cluster of weathered rocks, watching the procession through eyes that burned with sleepless fury. 3 days had passed since Ygritte's capture in Norvos. 3 days of following the slaver's trail across the harsh landscape of central Essos, and now he had finally caught up to them. The dragon eggs pressed against his back like brands, their heat having grown steadily stronger since Ygritte's abduction. In his dreams, they whispered to him in voices like distant thunder, speaking words in High Valyrian that he somehow understood despite never learning the ancient tongue. Dracarys, they seemed to say, fire and blood. But Jon forced himself to remain still, to think rather than simply react. Charging in blindly would only get them both killed. "Patience, lad," Thoros of Myr whispered beside him, though the Red Priest's own hands trembled with barely contained rage. A blood-stained bandage covered the crossbow wound in his shoulder, and his face was gaunt with pain and exhaustion. "We'll get her back, but we must be smart about it." Behind them, hidden in a dry riverbed, waited the small band of sellswords Thoros had managed to hire with the last of their gold. 6 men, all that remained of their resources after bribing informants and purchasing supplies for the pursuit. It wasn't enough for a direct assault against 30 slavers, but it would have to do. "There," Jon said quietly, pointing to a cage wagon near the center of the caravan. Through the iron bars he could see a flash of red hair that made his heart clench. "She's in the 3rd wagon." "I see her," Thoros confirmed. "But look at the guards. They're expecting trouble." Jon studied the caravan more carefully. The slavers had positioned their most experienced fighters around the cage wagons, and crossbowmen rode on elevated platforms that would give them clear fields of fire. It was a professional operation, not the ragtag band of brigands he had hoped to find. "They know we're following them," he realized. "Of course they do. We're not the first to attempt a rescue, and we won't be the last. These men have survived by being paranoid and prepared." A new voice cut through their whispered conversation. "Perhaps I can help." Jon spun around to find Lysander emerging from behind another rock cluster, his young face streaked with dirt and tears. The boy who had betrayed them looked even younger than his 11 years, and his clothes were torn from traveling hard across the rough terrain. "You," Jon snarled, his hand moving to his sword hilt. The dragon eggs flared with heat, responding to his anger. "Please," Lysander said, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Let me explain. Let me help." "Help?" Jon's voice was deadly quiet. "You sold us to those animals. Ygritte is in chains because of you." "I know," the boy whispered, fresh tears streaming down his cheeks. "And I'll carry that guilt until the day I die. But Jon, please, they have my sister. She's in that caravan too, in one of the other wagons. If we work together—" "No." Jon's refusal was flat and final. "I don't trust you. I'll never trust you again." Thoros placed a restraining hand on Jon's arm. "Wait, lad, the boy might be useful." "Useful?" Jon turned his burning gaze on the priest. "He betrayed us once. What's to stop him from doing it again?" "Because now our interests align," Thoros said reasonably. "He wants his sister back. We want Ygritte, and he knows the slavers' routines, their weaknesses." Lysander nodded eagerly. "I've been watching them for 2 days. I know which guards sleep when, where they keep the keys, everything. Please, Jon, let me make amends." Jon stared at the boy for a long moment, seeing the desperation and genuine remorse in his dark eyes. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to drive Lysander away or simply kill him for his betrayal. But Ygritte's life hung in the balance, and he couldn't let his anger cloud his judgment. "One chance," he said finally. "One chance to prove you're not completely worthless, but if you betray us again, I'll burn you alive with my bare hands." The boy shuddered at the cold promise in Jon's voice, but nodded. "I understand. Thank you." As the sun reached its zenith, the caravan called a halt for the midday rest. The slavers were experienced enough to know that traveling during the hottest part of the day would kill their valuable cargo, so they made camp in whatever shade they could find. Jon watched as guards were posted and routines established, memorizing every detail. "There," Lysander whispered, pointing to a grizzled man with a scarred face who seemed to be giving orders. "That's Krasnus Monoklos, the caravan master. He keeps the keys to all the cages on his person." And the guard rotations? Thoros asked. Heck, they change every 4 hours. The next change is at sunset. That's when they're most relaxed, when the new guards are still settling into their positions. Jon studied the layout of the camp, noting the positions of the cage wagons and the patrol routes of the guards. A plan was beginning to form in his mind. Desperate and dangerous, but potentially workable. The sellswords we hired, he said to Thoros. Can they create a distraction on the eastern side of the camp? Aye, they're good at making noise and drawing attention. But Jon, if you're thinking of going in alone, it's the only way. A small group might slip through unnoticed, but 6 men charging in will just get everyone killed. Then I'm coming with you, Lysander said quietly. Jon turned to stare at him. Why would I want your help? Because I know exactly where they keep the keys, and I can move through their camp without being noticed. They think I'm on their side, remember? It was a valid point, though Jon hated to admit it. And what about your sister? She's in the wagon next to Ygritte's. We can free them both. Jon looked to Thoros, who nodded reluctantly. The boy's right. You'll need someone who can move freely through their camp. Fine, Jon said. But Lysander, if this is another trap, if you're planning to betray us again, I want you to know that I'll make your death last for days. The boy paled but held Jon's gaze steadily. It's not a trap. I swear it on my sister's life. As the afternoon wore on, Jon felt the dragon eggs growing hotter against his back. In his mind he could hear whispers in High Valyrian, ancient voices speaking of fire and vengeance. The power was there waiting to be unleashed, but he forced himself to remain controlled. Ygritte's life depended on precision, not raw force. When the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, Thoros clasped Jon's shoulder. Remember, lad, wait for our signal, then move fast. We'll draw as many guards as we can to the eastern perimeter. And if something goes wrong, then trust in the fire that burns within you. Rislor will not abandon his chosen. Jon nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed in the Red God's protection anymore. If R'hllor truly watched over him, why had Ygritte been taken? Why did the innocent always seem to suffer while the guilty prospered? As darkness fell, Jon and Lysander crept toward the slaver camp. The boy moved with surprising stealth for his age, and Jon had to admit that his knowledge of the camp's layout was invaluable. They avoided the main patrol routes, slipping between wagons and tents like shadows. There, Lysander whispered, pointing to a large tent near the center of the camp. Krasny's is inside, probably counting his profits for the day. Jon could see the cage wagons just beyond the tent, their iron bars gleaming in the firelight. Somewhere in those cages, Ygritte waited for rescue. The thought of her suffering, of her fear and despair, made the dragon eggs burn like coals against his back. They were almost to the tent when everything went wrong. A shout rang out from the eastern perimeter, Thoros and his sellswords beginning their distraction. But instead of drawing guards away from the center of the camp, the slavers reacted with professional efficiency. Horns blew, and armed men began moving in coordinated patterns that spoke of long experience with rescue attempts. It's a trap, Jon realized, but too late. Crossbow bolts whistled through the air around them, and suddenly they were surrounded by slavers with drawn weapons. Jon reached for his sword, but a club struck him across the back of the head, sending him sprawling to the ground. Well, well, a familiar voice said in accented common tongue. The fire-touched comes to rescue his little wildling. How touching. Jon looked up to see Krasny's monoclas standing over him, the scarred slaver master's face twisted in a cruel smile. Behind him stood a dozen armed men, their weapons trained on Jon and Lysander. You knew we were coming, Jon said, tasting blood where he had bitten his tongue. Of course we knew. Did you think we were amateurs? We've been in this business for 20 years, boy. We know every trick, every desperate gambit that lovers and family members try. Jon's eyes found Lysander, and he saw guilt and terror warring in the boy's face. You, he whispered. You told them. I had to, Lysander stammered. They said they would kill my sister if I didn't cooperate. I thought maybe if I helped them capture you, they would let both our girls go. You fool, Krasny's laughed. Did you really think we would honor such a bargain? Your sister is worth good coin in the pleasure houses of lies. We're not about to give that up. Jon felt rage building in his chest, hot and pure as dragon fire. The eggs against his back were burning now, their heat so intense he could smell his shirt beginning to smolder. But before he could act, rough hands seized him and Lysander, dragging them toward the cage wagons. Chain them with the others, Krasny's ordered. We'll sort out their final destinations later. The cage wagon was a nightmare of human suffering. Dozens of people were crammed into the iron-barred space, men, women, and children of all ages, chained together in misery. The stench was overwhelming. Unwashed bodies, human waste, and the sour smell of despair. Jon was shoved inside and immediately felt familiar arms wrap around him. "Jon," Ygritte whispered, her voice hoarse from thirst and crying. "Oh gods, Jon, I thought I'd never see you again." He held her tightly, feeling the shackles on her wrists and ankles, seeing the bruises on her face where the slavers had struck her. "I'm here," he said softly. "I'm here, and I'm going to get us out of this." "How?" she asked. "We're chained, surrounded by guards. Even if you use your fire, you'll kill half the prisoners trying to break us free." It was a valid concern. The cage was packed so tightly that any significant use of his power would incinerate innocent people along with their captors. Jon looked around desperately, seeking some solution, some way to save everyone without becoming a monster in the process. That's when he noticed the girl chained next to Lysander. She was perhaps 9 years old, with the same dark hair and olive skin as the boy. Her eyes were wide with terror, and she clung to her brother with desperate hope. "Mira," Lysander whispered to her, "I'm here. I'm going to get you out of this." "Are you?" Jon asked coldly, "because so far your plans have only made things worse." The boy flinched but didn't argue. Around them, the other prisoners watched with the hollow eyes of people who had given up hope. Jon recognized the look. He had seen it in the faces of the dying during his travels through Essos, the expression of those who had accepted that their suffering would never end. But he refused to accept it. Ygritte was here, alive, and that meant there was still hope. As the night wore on, the camp settled into an uneasy quiet. Guards patrolled the perimeter, but most of the slavers had retired to their tents, confident that their prisoners were secure. Jon lay pressed against Ygritte's side, feeling her warmth and drawing strength from her presence. "I'm sorry," she whispered in the darkness. "I should have listened to you about the boy. Should have been more careful." "No," Jon replied firmly. "This is my fault. I trusted him when you warned me not to. I let my desire to help blind me to the danger." "We both made mistakes," she said. "But Jon, I need you to know something. If we don't make it out of this, if they sell us to different masters and we never see each other again, I need you to know that these past months with you have been the happiest of my life." Her words cut through him like a blade. "Don't talk like that. We're going to escape. We're going to find somewhere safe, somewhere we can be together." "Are we?" Her voice was soft, resigned. "Jon, look around us. We're chained in a cage, surrounded by professional slavers. Even if you burn through these bars, where would we run? We're in the middle of nowhere, with no supplies, no weapons, no allies. Thoros will come for us."
"Will he? How do you know he wasn't captured too? How do you know he's even still alive?"
Jon didn't have an answer for that. The Red Priest's distraction had failed, and there had been no sign of rescue in the hours since their capture. For all he knew, Thoros and the sellswords were dead, or fled. But as despair threatened to overwhelm him, Jon felt the dragon eggs pulse with warmth against his back. Somehow, the slavers had missed them when they searched him, perhaps assuming they were just ordinary stones wrapped in cloth. Now they seemed to respond to his emotional turmoil, growing hotter with each passing moment. "Sleep," he told himself, "rest, and perhaps the dreams will show you a way out." When sleep finally claimed him, Jon found himself standing in a vast cavern, lit by rivers of molten stone. The air shimmered with heat, and in the distance he could hear the sound of massive wings beating against stone. "Blood of fire," a voice rumbled from the darkness. "Child of snow and flame." Jon turned to see a dragon emerging from the shadows, its scales black as midnight, its eyes like burning coals. It was smaller than the great beasts of legend, but still magnificent, still terrible in its power. "You're not real," Jon said. "You're just a dream." "Am I?" the dragon asked, its voice like distant thunder. "Or am I the echo of what was, the promise of what could be?" "I don't understand." "You carry our children," the dragon said, moving closer. 3 eggs, 3 possibilities, 3 paths to power. But power without purpose is meaningless. What would you do with the strength of dragons, child of 2 worlds? Jon thought of Ygritte, chained and suffering in the cage beside him. "I would protect those I love. I would burn away the chains that bind the innocent." And what of the guilty? What of those who profit from suffering, who trade in human misery? "I would burn them too," Jon said, without hesitation. The dragon's laugh was like the roar of a forge. Then wake, child of fire, wake and claim your birthright. Jon's eyes snapped open to find the cage wagon filled with an eerie red glow. The dragon eggs in his pack were burning like stars, their heat so intense that the cloth wrapping them had begun to smolder. Around him, the other prisoners stirred uneasily, sensing something was happening, but not understanding what. "Jon," Ygritte whispered urgently, "your pack, it's glowing." He could feel the power building, the ancient magic contained within the eggs responding to his need, his desperation, his rage. But he also remembered the dragon's words, "Power without purpose is meaningless." What was his purpose? To escape? To survive? Or something greater? Before he could decide, shouts erupted from outside the cage. Fire! Fire in the eastern camp! Jon looked through the bars to see flames rising from several tents, and armed figures moving through the smoke. Thoros had returned, and this time he had brought help. "Now," Jon whispered to Ygritte, "whatever happens next, stay close to me." He reached for the dragon eggs, feeling their heat burn through the cloth wrapping. As his fingers made contact with the ancient stone, power flooded through him like molten gold. The shackles on his wrists began to glow red hot, then white hot, then simply melted away like wax. Around him, the other prisoners gasped in amazement and terror as Jon rose to his feet, fire dancing around his hands like living things. The iron bars of the cage began to bend and warp under the supernatural heat, and within moments, a gap large enough for a person to squeeze through had appeared. "Go," he told the other prisoners. "Run, hide, find whatever freedom you can." Most needed no further encouragement, squeezing through the gap and disappearing into the chaos of the burning camp. But Ygritte remained at his side, and Lysander clutched his sister protectively. "Jon," the boy said desperately, "please, take Myra with you. She's just a child. She doesn't deserve this." Jon looked at the terrified girl, seeing his own helplessness reflected in her eyes. "Can you run?" he asked her. She nodded mutely. "Then stay close to Ygritte. Don't let go of her hand, no matter what happens." They emerged from the cage wagon into a scene of utter chaos. Thoros and his sellswords had set fire to half the camp, and slavers ran in all directions, trying to organize a defense while also protecting their valuable cargo. In the confusion, it was impossible to tell friend from foe. "This way," Jon said, leading them toward the edge of the camp where the darkness would provide cover. But they had only taken a few steps when a crossbow bolt whistled past his ear. There, Krasny's Monoclos stood near his command tent, pointing at them with one hand while the other held a loaded crossbow. The fire touched. "Don't let him escape." More slavers converged on their position, weapons drawn and faces grim with professional determination. Jon raised his hands, feeling the dragon fire build within him, but Ygritte caught his arm. "Too many innocents," she said urgently. "You'll kill the other prisoners." She was right. Freed slaves were running in all directions, and any large-scale use of his power would incinerate them along with their captors. Jon cursed under his breath, looking for another option. That's when Lysander stepped forward. "I'll hold them off," the boy said, drawing a knife he had somehow acquired. "Get the girls to safety." "You can't fight them all," Jon protested. "I don't need to fight them all. I just need to buy you time." Before Jon could stop him, Lysander charged toward the approaching slavers, his knife glinting in the firelight. The boy was brave. Jon had to give him that, but bravery wouldn't be enough against trained fighters. The first slaver's sword took Lysander in the shoulder, spinning him around. The second blade caught him in the ribs, and he went down hard. But even as he fell, the boy managed to drive his knife into his attacker's thigh, causing the man to stumble and curse. "Lysander!" his sister screamed, trying to run to him, but Ygritte held her back. Jon felt rage building in his chest, hot and pure as dragon fire. The boy had betrayed them, yes, but he was also trying to make amends, trying to save his sister and protect those he had wronged. And now he was dying for it. The dragon eggs blazed against his back, their heat so intense that his shirt burst into flames. Jon barely noticed. His attention focused on the slavers who were now advancing on their position with confident smiles. "Surrender, boy," Krasny called out. "You're outnumbered and outmatched. Give up now, and we might let your friends live." Jon's response was to raise his hands, letting fire dance between his fingers. "I have a better idea," he said quietly. "Why don't you run?" The flames that erupted from his hands were unlike anything he had produced before. They burned white hot, so intense that they turned sand to glass and metal to vapor. The slavers' confident advance became a panicked retreat as the supernatural fire washed over them. But Jon's control was slipping. The rage, the fear, the desperate need to protect those he loved, it all combined to feed the flames, making them burn hotter and spread further than he intended. He could hear screams from all directions, could smell burning flesh and melting metal. "Jon!" Ygritte's voice cut through the roar of the flames. "Jon, stop! You're killing everyone!" He tried to pull back, to regain control, but the power had taken on a life of its own. The dragon eggs were burning like miniature suns against his back, and he could hear ancient voices whispering in High Valyrian, urging him to let the fire consume everything. That's when he felt a hand on his shoulder. "Easy, lad," Thoros said, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. "Easy. Remember who you are, remember why you fight." The Red Priest's touch seemed to ground him, to remind him of his humanity. Slowly, painfully, Jon pulled the flames back into himself, feeling them settle like coals in his chest. When the fire finally died, the camp was a scene of devastation. Tents and wagons burned like funeral pyres, and bodies lay scattered across the sand. Most of the slavers were dead or fled, but so were many of the prisoners who had been caught in the flames. "Lysander," Mira whispered, pulling free from Ygritte's grip and running to where her brother lay. Jon followed, his heart heavy with guilt and sorrow. The boy was still alive, but barely, blood seeped from multiple wounds. And his breathing was shallow and labored. Did they get away?" Lysander asked weakly. "Mira and the others?" "They're safe," Jon said, kneeling beside him. "You saved them." A smile crossed the boy's face. "Good, that's good." "I'm sorry," Jon said. "I'm sorry I didn't trust you. Sorry I couldn't save you." "Don't be," Lysander replied. "I made my choices. I betrayed you, then tried to make it right. That's more than most people get." His eyes found his sister's face. "Mira, be strong. Find good people to follow. Not like me." The girl was crying, clutching her brother's hand. "Don't leave me. Please don't leave me." "I have to," he whispered. "But I'll watch over you. I promise." Lysander's eyes closed, and his breathing stopped. Jon felt a familiar weight settle on his shoulders. Another death, another life lost because of his choices and his power. "He died well," Thoros said quietly. "He found redemption in the end." "Did he?" Jon asked. "Or did he just die because I couldn't control my anger?" Before the priest could answer, Ygritte gasped and stumbled. Jon caught her as she fell, and his hands came away wet with blood. "Ygritte!" he cried, seeing the crossbow bolt protruding from her back. In the chaos of the battle, he hadn't noticed that she had been hit. "I'm all right," she said weakly, but Jon could see that she wasn't. The bolt had gone deep, and blood was spreading across her shirt with alarming speed. "Thoros," Jon called desperately. "Help her." The Red Priest knelt beside them, his face grave as he examined the wound. "The bolt went through her lung," he said quietly. "I can try to heal her, but..." "But what?" Jon demanded. "But I'm not sure my power is strong enough. She's lost too much blood." Jon felt the dragon eggs pulse against his back, their heat offering power, offering the strength to save her. But he also remembered the devastation he had just caused, the innocent lives lost to his uncontrolled rage. "There has to be something," he said desperately. "Some way to save her." Ygritte's hand found his, her grip weak, but determined. "Jon," she whispered. "Listen to me." "Don't talk," he said. "Save your strength." "No, I need to say this." Her green eyes met his, and he saw love there, and sadness, and a terrible acceptance. "You're going to be something great, Jon Snow, something more than they ever dreamed. But don't let them chain you with their expectations." "I don't care about being great," he said, tears streaming down his face. "I just want you to live." "I know," she said softly. "And that's why you'll be better than them. Better than the kings and priests, and all the rest. You care about people, not power." Her breathing was growing more labored, and Jon could see the light beginning to fade from her eyes. "Don't leave me," he pleaded. "Please, Ygritte. I can't do this without you." "Yes, you can," she said with the ghost of a smile. "You're stronger than you know. And Jon, when you find your dragons, when you claim your birthright, remember that I believed in you. Remember that I loved you." "I love you too," he whispered. I know, she said, her voice barely audible now. That's why this hurts so much. Her eyes closed, and her hand went limp in his. Jon felt something break inside him, some essential part of his soul that he knew would never heal. The girl who had been his first love, his companion, his anchor to humanity, was gone. Around him the camp burned in the darkness, and the freed slaves scattered to whatever freedom they could find. Mira knelt beside her brother's body, crying softly. Thoros stood with his head bowed, offering silent prayers to his fire god. And Jon Snow, 13 years old and already marked by power and tragedy, held the body of the girl he loved, and felt the dragon eggs burn against his back like brands of destiny. The boy who had kissed Ygritte on a rooftop in Norvos was gone, burned away by grief and rage, and the terrible weight of power. In his place sat something harder, colder, more dangerous. A young man who had learned that love was the cruelest chain of all, and that freedom always came at a price paid in blood. The dragons were stirring, and when they finally woke, the world would learn what it meant to face fire and blood unleashed by a broken heart. But for now there was only grief, and the sound of flames consuming everything he had ever cared about. The battlefield stretched before Jon Snow like a canvas painted in blood and ash. Smoke rose from the smoldering remains of the slaver caravan, and the acrid smell of burned flesh hung heavy in the desert air. Bodies lay scattered across the sand, slavers and prisoners alike, their lives extinguished in the inferno of his rage. But Jon saw none of it. His world had narrowed to the still form in his arms, to the weight of Ygritte's lifeless body against his chest. He walked through the carnage like a sleepwalker, his feet finding their own path, while his mind reeled with grief and disbelief. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. Just hours ago, she had been alive, warm, whispering words of love and hope in the darkness of their cage. Now she was cold, her green eyes closed forever, her red hair dulled with dust and blood. "Jon," Thoros called from somewhere behind him, but the voice seemed to come from very far away. "Jon, lad, we need to go. There may be other slavers in the area. Reinforcements." "Let them come," Jon said quietly, his voice hollow as an empty tomb. The dragon eggs pressed against his back, their heat so intense now that his shirt had long since burned away. They pulsed with each beat of his heart, as if they were alive, as if they were responding to his pain and fury. In his mind he could hear whispers in High Valyrian, ancient voices speaking of fire and vengeance, of blood and rebirth. "Dracarys," they seemed to say. "Burn them all." A sound made him look up, laughter, cruel and mocking. Through the smoke and flames, figures emerged from the far side of the camp. Slavers who had survived the initial assault, perhaps 20 men armed with curved swords and crossbows. Their leader was a tall man with gold teeth and elaborate tattoos covering his shaved head, his silk robes somehow untouched by the chaos around them. "Look what we have here," the man called out, in the bastard Valyrian of the slave cities. A boy playing with fire, crying over his little whore. Jon stopped walking. Around him, the surviving members of Thoros' sellsword company were taking defensive positions, but they were outnumbered and exhausted. The Red Priest himself stood nearby, his wounded shoulder making his movements slow and awkward. "She was beautiful, wasn't she?" the slaver continued, his gold teeth glinting in the firelight. "Such pretty red hair. We could have gotten good coin for her in the pleasure houses of Lyce. What a waste." Something cold and terrible settled in Jon's chest, like ice forming over a deep well. The dragon eggs burned against his back, but their heat felt distant now, separate from the frozen rage that was building inside him. "You know what we do to boys who burn our property?" the slaver asked, drawing his sword. "We sell them to the fighting pits of Myr. The crowd loves to watch children die. They scream so sweetly." Jon gently laid Ygritte's body on the sand, arranging her hair around her face, closing her eyes with trembling fingers. When he stood, his movements were deliberate, controlled, like a predator preparing to strike. "You talk too much," he said quietly. The slaver laughed. "Do I? And what are you going to do about it, boy? Burn us with your magic fire. We've heard the stories, but you're just a child playing with powers beyond his understanding." Jon reached behind him and pulled the dragon eggs from his pack. They were hot as coals in his hands, their ancient stone surfaces pulsing with inner light. The whispers in his mind grew louder, more insistent, speaking words of power that seemed to resonate in his very bones. "These are dragon eggs," he said, holding them up for all to see. They'd been sleeping for 300 years, waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right sacrifice. The slavers shifted uneasily, their earlier confidence beginning to waver. Even hardened killers knew the legends of dragons, knew what such creatures could do to those who opposed them. Dragon eggs are just pretty stones, the leader said, but his voice lacked conviction. The dragons are all dead. Everyone knows that. Jon looked down at Grit's still form, at the face that would never smile at him again, never tease him about his brooding, never whisper words of love in the darkness. The ice in his chest began to crack, and beneath it, he felt something vast and terrible stirring. "You're right," he said softly. "The dragons are dead, but death is just another kind of birth." He pressed the eggs against his chest, feeling their heat burn through his skin. The whispers in his mind became a roar, ancient voices crying out in triumph and recognition. Power flooded through him, not the controlled flame he had wielded before, but something primal and overwhelming, like the fire at the heart of the world. "I gave you my heart," he whispered to Ygritte's body. "I gave you everything I had, and they took you from me. They took you and laughed." The eggs began to crack. Jon Thoros called urgently. "Jon, whatever you're doing, be careful. That much power." Power. Jon's voice was changing, becoming something deeper, more resonant. "This isn't about power. This is about justice. This is about making them pay." The first egg split open with a sound like thunder, and from within emerged something that made even the hardened slavers step back in terror. It was small, no larger than a cat, but unmistakably a dragon. Its scales were black as midnight, darker than shadow, and its eyes burned like coals in the darkness. When it spread its wings, they seemed to drink in the light around them. The second egg cracked a moment later, revealing a creature of crimson and silver, its scales shimmering like liquid fire. It was slightly larger than its sibling, and when it opened its mouth, a thin stream of flame emerged, no bigger than a candle's flame, but hot enough to turn sand to glass. The slavers stared in stunned silence, their weapons forgotten in the face of the impossible. Dragons. Living, breathing dragons, born from stone and fire in the grief of a 13-year-old boy. "Impossible," the leader whispered. "The dragons are extinct. They've been dead for centuries." Jon looked up at him, and the slaver took an involuntary step backward. The boy's eyes were different now, older somehow, filled with an ancient knowledge that had nothing to do with his 13 years. "Death is not the end," Jon said, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "It's just the beginning of something new." The black dragon climbed up his arm to perch on his shoulder, its claws digging into his skin, but causing no pain. The crimson one coiled around his other arm like a living bracelet, its warmth a comfort against the cold rage in his heart. "You wanted to see fire," Jon said to the slavers. "Let me show you fire." He raised his hand, and the dragons responded. The black one opened its mouth and breathed shadow flame, dark fire that consumed light itself. The crimson one added its own breath, flames that burned silver bright and hot as the sun's core. Together they created something that had never been seen before. Fire that burned both light and dark, that consumed matter and energy alike. The slavers screamed as the flames washed over them, but their cries were cut short as the dragon fire reduced them to ash in seconds. Even their weapons and armor were consumed, leaving nothing but empty air where 20 men had stood moments before. But Jon wasn't finished. The rage that had been building inside him since Ygritte's capture, since her death, since the moment he realized that the world was a place where innocence suffered and the guilty prospered, all of it poured out of him in a torrent of flame and fury. The remaining wagons of the caravan caught fire, their wooden frames exploding into splinters as the dragon flame consumed them. The very sand beneath his feet began to melt and flow like water, forming strange patterns that seemed to writhe and move in the flickering light. "Jon!" Thoros shouted over the roar of the flames. "Jon, you have to stop. You're going to kill us all." But Jon was beyond hearing, beyond reason. In his mind, he could see every injustice he had witnessed, every cruelty he had been powerless to prevent, the slaves in chains, the children sold to pleasure houses, the innocent dying while the guilty lived in luxury. All of it demanded payment, demanded justice, demanded fire and blood. The dragons on his arms grew larger as they fed on his rage, their bodies expanding from the size of cats to the size of small dogs. Their flames grew hotter, more intense, until the very air around Jon shimmered with heat waves. It was Myra who stopped him. The little girl, Lysander's sister, who was near Jon at the moment, walked between the flames as if they were nothing more than warm summer air. She was crying, tears streaming down her dirt-stained face, but she showed no fear as she approached the boy who had become something more than human. "Please," she said in her small, broken voice. "Please stop. My brother is dead. Ygritte is dead. Don't let their deaths be for nothing." Jon looked down at her, and for a moment the ancient fire in his eyes flickered. "They killed her," he said, his voice cracking with grief. "They killed her and laughed about it." "I know," Myra said, reaching out to touch his hand. "But burning everything won't bring her back. It won't bring any of them back." The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. Jon staggered, the flames around him guttering and dying as his control reasserted itself. The dragons on his arms settled back to their original size, though their eyes still burned with inner fire. "I will never apologize for what I did," he whispered, looking around at the devastation he had wrought. "I have realized that some people are just better be dead than alive, and I will never show mercy to my enemies again. I will not kill innocent, but do not expect me to spare someone whose death can save many, even if there is one sacrifice from now on. Don't worry, lad, I have done far worse and you did what you had to do," Thoros said quietly, approaching with careful steps. "What any man would do when faced with such loss." The Red Priest's face was pale with awe and terror. In all his years serving Rolhor, he had never witnessed anything like what he had just seen. The birth of dragons was the stuff of legend, of ancient prophecies and half-remembered songs. To see it happen before his eyes, to witness the moment when myth became reality. "You are the Dragon Lord Reborn," Thoros said, his voice filled with reverence. "The prince that was promised, the one who will bring fire to the world." "No," Jon said firmly, the word cutting through the priest's wonder like a blade. "I'm not a prince, I'm not a lord, I'm just Jon Snow." "You are more than that now," Thoros insisted. "The dragons have chosen you. The fire of the ancients burns in your veins. You cannot deny what you are." Jon looked down at the two small dragons perched on his arms. They were beautiful and terrible, creatures of legend made flesh through his pain and rage. But they were also his responsibility now, his burden to bear. "What am I supposed to do with them?" he asked. "Raise them," Thoros said. "Train them, use them to reshape the world according to your will." "My will?" Jon's laugh was bitter. "I couldn't even save the girl I loved. What makes you think I'm qualified to reshape anything?" Around them, the surviving members of their small band were emerging from whatever cover they had found during the dragonfire. Some of the sellswords Thoros had hired were already backing away, their faces pale with terror. Others, however, were moving closer, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and avarice. "Dragons," one of them whispered. "Real, living dragons. Do you know what this means?" "It means we're rich," another replied. "A man with dragons could conquer kingdoms, could take whatever he wanted." Jon's eyes flashed with anger, and both dragons hissed in response to his emotions. "Is that what you think this is about? Conquest? Wealth?" The sellswords had the grace to look ashamed, but Jon could see the calculations in their eyes. They were already thinking of the possibilities, of the power that dragons represented. "Leave all those who are hungry for power and wealth, as I will not chase it, and stay, if you want family, friends, and loyalty, but beware that I will not be any merciful for betrayers and those who do not obey and kill innocent," he said quietly. "Take whatever payment you're owed, and go." "Jon," Thoros protested. "You need allies. You need people you can trust." "Do I?" Jon asked, "because it seems to me that trusting people is what got Ygritte killed." The Red Priest flinched at the accusation, but he didn't argue. They both knew that if they had been more careful, more suspicious of Lysander's motives, Ygritte might still be alive. One by one, the ones who were not satisfied with what Jon said departed, some taking horses and supplies, others simply walking away into the desert night. A few stayed, some clearly hoping for what Jon had said, and some for other reasons. Soon, only Jon, Thoros, Myra, and a few remained in the ruins of the slaver camp. The little girl sat beside her brother's body, singing a soft lullaby in a language Jon didn't recognize. Her voice was sweet and pure, a stark contrast to the devastation around them. "What about her?" Thoros asked quietly. Jon looked at Myra, seeing the same lost expression he had worn when he first arrived in Essos. She was alone now, with no family, no protection, no future except whatever mercy strangers might show her. "She comes with us," he said, "if she wants to." "And where exactly are we going?" Thoros asked. "Word of what happened here will spread. By tomorrow, half of Essos will know that dragons have returned to the world. Every king, every magister, every ambitious fool with an army will be hunting us." Jon considered this. The priest was right. The birth of the dragons changed everything. They could never again be anonymous travelers. Could never again blend into crowds or hide in shadows. From now on, they would be targets. Prizes to be captured or threats to be eliminated. "Then we go somewhere they can't follow," he said finally. "Somewhere we can be safe while the dragons grow." "And where might that be?" Jon looked up at the stars before replying. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but we'll find it." As dawn approached, Jon began the grim task of preparing Ygritte for burial. He wrapped her body in the finest cloth he could find among the slaver's possessions, arranging her red hair around her face one last time. The dragons watched solemnly from nearby, as if they understood the significance of the moment. "She was brave," Thoros said, helping to dig the grave in the hard-packed earth. "Braver than most men I've known." "She was everything," Jon replied simply. They buried her as the sun rose over the eastern mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Jon painfully of her hair. Mira sang another lullaby, this one in the common tongue, about a girl who loved the wind and the wild places of the world. When it was done, Jon knelt beside the grave and placed his hand on the simple stone marker they had erected. The dragons perched on his shoulders, their warmth a comfort against the morning chill. "I promise you," he whispered to the earth that held her. "I promise that your death won't be meaningless. I'll use these dragons, use this power, to make a world where children don't die in chains, where innocents don't suffer for the greed of others." He stood, feeling older than his 13 years, feeling the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders like a cloak of fire. "If the world wants dragons," he said, his voice carrying across the empty desert, "I'll give it dragons, but not for conquest, not for glory. For justice." The black dragon, which he had decided to call Balian after the great beast of legend, nuzzled against his neck with surprising gentleness. The crimson one, which reminded him of the flames in Ygritte's hair, coiled around his arm like a living memory. "What will you call that one?" Thoros asked. Jon looked at the crimson dragon, seeing the silver streaks in its scales that caught the morning light like tears. "Ygritte," he said softly. "Her name is Ygritte." As they prepared to leave the battlefield behind, word was already spreading across the trade routes of Essos. Merchants who had witnessed the flames from a distance carried tales of a boy who commanded dragons, of fire that burned hotter than the sun, of the return of magic to a world that had forgotten its power. In the great cities of the Free Cities, magisters and archons gathered in secret councils, debating what this development might mean for their carefully balanced world of trade and politics. In the slave cities of Slaver's Bay, masters clutched their whips tighter and doubled the guards on their human property, remembering ancient stories of dragons and the doom they brought to those who trafficked in human misery. But Jon Snow knew none of this as he walked away from Ygritte's grave, the dragons on his shoulders, and a broken-hearted girl at his side. He knew only that the world had taken everything he loved, and that he now had the power to take something back. The age of dragons had begun again, born not from prophecy or ambition, but from the grief of a 13-year-old boy who had learned that sometimes the only way to honor the dead was to make the living pay. And in the distance, carried on the desert wind, came the sound of wings beating against the sky, not large enough yet to darken the sun, but growing stronger with each passing hour. The dragons were awake, and they were hungry. The world would never be the same. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the burned remnants of the slaver camp, as Jon Snow knelt beside Ygritte's grave for the third time that week. The simple stone marker bore no inscription. There had been no time for such luxuries, but the mound of earth was already showing signs of the wildflowers that grew in abundance across the Dothraki Sea. She would have liked that, he thought. She had always loved wild things. Darien, the black dragon perched on his left shoulder, shifted restlessly as if sensing his master's dark mood. The creature had grown considerably in the 10 days since hatching, and his scales had taken on an almost mirror-like quality that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. On Jon's right shoulder, Ygritte, named for the girl who would never again laugh at his brooding, preened her crimson and silver scales with delicate precision. She was slightly larger than her black brother, and far more aggressive when strangers approached. "Grief is a luxury we cannot afford much longer," Thoros of Myr said, approaching with his characteristic limp. The Red Priest's shoulder wound had healed poorly, leaving him with a permanent reminder of their failed rescue mission. "The men grow restless, and our supplies won't last another week." Jon didn't look up from the grave. "Let them be restless. Let them leave if they choose. I didn't ask them to follow me." "No, but they do follow you, and that makes their welfare your responsibility, whether you asked for it or not." The words stung because they were true. In the chaos following the dragon hatching, Jon had found himself the de facto leader of the survivors. 24 sellswords, half a dozen freed slaves, and young Mira, who had appointed herself as caretaker to both dragons and their master. It was a responsibility he had never wanted and felt wholly unprepared for. "I'm 13 years old," Jon said quietly. "What do I know about leading men? You know enough to have kept them alive this long. You know enough to inspire loyalty in creatures that haven't walked the earth for 3 centuries. Thoros gestured at the dragons. "That's more than most lords twice your age can claim." Jon finally stood, brushing dirt from his knees. The dragons took flight briefly before settling back on his shoulders, their claws finding purchase in the leather padding he had fashioned to protect his skin. "What would you have me do? March them into the nearest city and proclaim myself a conqueror. I would have you stop wallowing in self-pity and start thinking like a leader. Your grief honors the dead, but it won't help the living." The harsh words hit their mark, and Jon felt a familiar coldness settle in his chest, the same ice that had filled him in the moments before the dragons hatched. Since Ygritte's death, he had felt that coldness more often, a shield against the pain that threatened to overwhelm him. It was easier to be cold than to feel the full weight of his loss. "Fine," he said, his voice taking on the flat tone that had become increasingly common. "What do you suggest?" Thoros studied him carefully, and Jon saw something like concern flicker in the priest's eyes. "First, we need to address the division in the ranks. Half the men think you're blessed by Rehor, the other half whisper that you're cursed. Neither group is entirely wrong, but both are dangerous in their own way." Jon looked toward their camp, where he could see the clear divisions Thoros spoke of. Sir Gareth Blackwater, a former Knight of the Reach, stood with the older, more experienced fighters. They spoke in low voices, their eyes occasionally flicking toward Jon with expressions that ranged from awe to unease. On the other side of the camp, a group of younger men barely older than Jon himself tended their horses with the nervous energy of those still trying to prove themselves. "And second," Jon asked. "Second, you need to learn to control the fire that burns in your blood. The dragons are growing stronger every day, and their power is tied to yours. If you don't learn to channel it properly, you'll burn yourself out, or worse, burn everyone around you." As if summoned by his words, Ygritte the dragon lifted her head and released a thin stream of flame that turned a nearby rock to slag. The display of power was casual, almost playful, but it served as a stark reminder of what these creatures could become. "How do I do that?" Jon asked. "The same way you do everything else, one step at a time. Come." They walked back toward the camp, passing the blackened crater where Jon's rage had been unleashed 10 days ago. The sand had been turned to glass in some places, creating strange twisted sculptures that caught the morning light. Several of the men made warding gestures when they passed the spot, and Jon noticed that even the horses gave it a wide berth. "Sit," Thoros commanded when they reached the central fire pit. "Focus on the flames. Don't try to control them yet. Just watch and listen." Jon settled cross-legged beside the fire, the dragons adjusting their positions to perch on his knees. The flames danced and flickered in the morning breeze, and gradually Jon began to see patterns in their movement, not random chaos, but something almost like a language. "What do you see?" Thoros asked softly. "Movement. Purpose. Like the fire is trying to tell me something." "Good. Now reach out with your mind, not your hand. Feel the heat, the energy, the life within the flames." Jon closed his eyes and extended his consciousness toward the fire. At first, there was nothing but warmth against his face. Then, gradually, he began to sense something more, a presence, ancient and vast, that seemed to recognize him. "Child of ice and fire," a voice whispered in his mind, speaking in High Valyrian, "blood of the dragon, heir to flame and shadow." Dorne's eyes snapped open, and the fire flared in response to his sudden movement. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Thoros leaned forward, his expression intent. "A voice, speaking in High Valyrian." The priest's face went pale. "What did it say?" Jon repeated the words, and Thoros sat back with a sharp intake of breath. "Roar, preserve us. The Lord of Light himself speaks to you." "Or I'm going mad from grief," Jon said flatly. "Perhaps, but madness and prophecy often walk hand in hand. Try again, but this time don't fight what you hear. Let the visions come." Jon looked into the flames again, and this time the images came more easily. He saw flashes of the future or possible futures flickering like scenes from a mummer's play. Armies marching under dragon banners, cities burning, chains breaking, and through it all a figure that might have been himself, older and harder, commanding from Dragonback while the world trembled. But there were darker visions too. Betrayal and death, the corruption that came with absolute power, the slow transformation from liberator to tyrant. And always, always the cold that lived in his heart growing stronger until it consumed everything else. "I see myself becoming a monster," he said quietly. "Then don't become one," Thoros replied. "The future is not fixed, Jon. Every choice you make changes what might come to pass." Easy words. Nothing worthwhile is ever easy. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Ser Gareth Blackwater. The former knight was a man of 40-odd years, his brown hair streaked with premature gray and his face marked by old scars. He had fled Westeros after killing his lord's son in a duel over a woman's honor, or so he claimed. Jon suspected the truth was more complicated. "My lord," Gareth said, the title coming reluctantly from his lips. "We need to talk." Jon gestured for him to sit, noting how the man's eyes tracked the dragon's every movement. "Speak freely, Sarah." "The men are growing restless. We've been camped here for 10 days with no clear purpose, no destination. Some are talking of leaving to seek employment elsewhere." "Then let them leave," Jon said coldly. "I won't hold anyone against their will." Gareth's eyebrows rose at the harsh tone. "With respect, my lord, we can't afford to lose anyone. We're already undermanned for any serious contract." "Who says I want a contract?" "Then what do you want?" The question came out sharper than Gareth had probably intended. "Forgive me, but you're 13 years old and you command 2 dragons that could burn down a city. Men need to know what they're following you toward." Jon stood abruptly, the dragons taking flight to circle overhead. Several nearby conversations stopped, as men turned to watch the exchange. He could feel their attention like a weight on his shoulders, their hopes and fears and expectations pressing down on him.
"You want to know what I want?"
Jon's voice carried clearly across the camp. "I want justice. I want slavers to fear the sound of wings in the sky. I want tyrants to wake in the night, wondering if today is the day their sins catch up with them." Murmurs rippled through the gathered men. Some nodded approval, others looked uncertain. "Pretty words," Gareth said carefully. "But justice doesn't put food in our bellies or coin in our purses." "No," Jon agreed. "But it gives us something worth fighting for. Something worth dying for, if necessary." "And what about those of us who'd rather live?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jon felt the coldness in his chest spread, and when he spoke again, his voice carried an edge that made several men step back. "Then you're free to go, Ser Gareth. All of you are. I'm not my father, I won't hold men to oaths they're not willing to keep." The dismissal was clear, and for a moment Jon thought the knight would take it. Then Gareth's expression shifted, and he dropped to one knee. "I didn't say I wanted to leave, my lord, I just wanted to know what I was staying for." One by one, the other men followed suit. Not all of them. 3 sellswords gathered their belongings and departed within the hour, but enough, more than enough. "Rise," Jon said, and there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before. Authority. Command. "If you're staying, then we need to establish some things. First, we're not sellswords anymore. We're something new." "What are we, then?" asked one of the Lysani twins. Damon. Jon could never tell them apart. "We're the Black Wolves," Jon said, the name coming to him as he spoke. For the wolf of Stark and the dragons we serve. The black wolves, Thoros repeated, tasting the words. I like it. Second, Jon continued, we don't take contracts from slavers, tyrants, or anyone who profits from human misery. We fight for those who can't fight for themselves. And how do we eat while we're being so noble? Ser Gareth asked, though his tone was more curious than challenging now. Jon's smile was cold as winter. We take what we need from those who have too much. Slavers have gold. Pirates have treasure. Tyrants have wealth stolen from their people. All of it can be redistributed to more deserving hands. You're talking about becoming bandits, one of the freedmen pointed out. I'm talking about becoming something the world needs, Jon replied. Something it's been missing for 300 years. Over the following days, Jon threw himself into the work of forging his disparate followers into something resembling a cohesive unit. He was not a natural leader, that much became clear quickly, but he was a determined one. Where charm and charisma failed him, cold competence filled the gap. Thoros continued his lessons in fire channeling, teaching Jon to light flames with a thought, to shield himself from heat that would have killed an ordinary man, and to read the visions that danced in the fire. The dragons grew stronger too, their bond with Jon deepening with each passing day. They could sense his emotions now, responding to his anger with hisses and small gouts of flame, calming when he was at peace. But peace was a rare commodity in Jon's heart these days. The coldness that had settled there after Ygritte's death seemed to be spreading, making him more calculating, more willing to accept harsh necessities. When a group of Dothraki raiders approached their camp, Jon didn't try to negotiate or flee. Instead, he sent the dragons ahead to scatter their horses, then led his men in a swift, brutal attack that left no survivors. You're changing, Thoros observed that night as they burned the bodies. Growing harder. The world is hard, Jon replied, watching the flames consume their enemies. Soft men don't survive in it. Your father was not a soft man, but he was not hard either. He was just. My father never had dragons. He never watched the woman he loved die because he was too weak to protect her. Jon's voice was flat, emotionless. Justice is a luxury for those with the power to enforce it. I'm learning to be powerful. The priest said nothing, but Jon could see the concern in his eyes. Let him worry, Jon thought. Worry was better than the alternative. Meanwhile, in Winterfell, Eddard Stark stood in his solar, reading the latest letter from his agents in Essos for the third time. The words hadn't changed, but he kept hoping they would somehow make more sense. Dragons, he thought. My son commands dragons. The reports were fragmentary and contradictory, filtered through multiple sources and colored by disbelief, but the core facts remained consistent. Jon had somehow hatched dragon eggs, and now led a company of sellswords across the Dothraki Sea. The boy who had left Winterfell as Thoros' squire had become something out of legend. Catelyn won't believe it, he murmured to himself. His wife had never warmed to Jon, but even she would be shocked by this news. More concerning were the reports of Jon's character. The boy Ned remembered had been earnest and honorable, perhaps too much so for his own good. But the young man described in these letters was something else. Cold, calculating, willing to use dragon fire against his enemies, without mercy. What have I done? Ned wondered. What kind of suffering my boy went through to change so much? I have to send my informers over there to know the situation. He had sent Jon away to protect him from Robert's paranoia about Targaryens and the stain of bastardy from ruining him, never imagining that the boy would suffer from who knows what and will awake his dragon blood. Now that blood had awakened, and with it powers that could reshape the balance of power across 2 continents. Father, Robb's voice came from the doorway. You sent for me? Ned looked up at his eldest son, his heir, the boy who would one day rule Winterfell in his place. Robb had Jon's coloring, but Catelyn's features, and at 15 he was already showing signs of the man he would become. Sit, Ned said, gesturing to a chair. We need to discuss your brother. Which brother? Brian's been climbing again. Despite what happened to Jon. Robb's expression grew serious. The 2 boys had been close before Jon's departure, closer than brothers in some ways. What about him? Has something happened? Ned handed him the letter. Read this. Robb's eyes widened as he scanned the parchment. Dragons? Father, this has to be some kind of jest. Dragons have been extinct 300 years. Yes, I know. Ned rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of secrets he could never share. but the reports are consistent, multiple sources, all telling the same impossible tale. If it's true, Robb trailed off, the implications too vast to comprehend. If it's true, then your brother may's become one of the most powerful people in the world. And power, as you well know, brings its own dangers. Robb was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the news. What do? We watch. We wait. And we pray that the boy I raised remembers the lessons I taught him. Ned's voice was heavy with worry, because if he doesn't, the world may burn for it. In King's Landing, Lord Varys glided through the secret passages of the Red Keep like a spider navigating its web, his mind racing with the implications of his latest intelligence. Dragons had returned to the world, and not in the hands of some Targaryen pretender across the sea, but in the possession of Eddard Stark's bastard son. How deliciously unexpected, he thought, and how very, very dangerous. The reports from his little birds in Essos painted a picture of a young man transformed by tragedy and power. Jon Snow had begun as an idealistic boy seeking adventure, but grief and responsibility were forging him into something harder, more pragmatic. The kind of person who might actually succeed where so many others had failed. Varys paused in his chambers, surrounded by the tools of his trade, coded letters, maps marked with the movements of armies, portraits of the great players in the Game of Thrones. He added a new piece to his collection, a rough sketch of a young man with dragons perched on his shoulders, based on eyewitness accounts from the Dothraki Sea. "What are you becoming, young Snow?" he whispered to the image. "And more importantly, what will you do with the power you're gathering?" The spymaster had built his career on predicting the actions of powerful men, but this development fell outside all his careful calculations. A dragon lord with Stark blood, raised in honor but tempered by harsh realities, such a person could reshape the balance of power across two continents. More concerning still were the reports of the boy's growing ruthlessness. Idealism was predictable, but cold pragmatism in the hands of someone with dragons was a recipe for chaos. "The realm is not ready for dragons," Varys murmured. "But ready or not, they come." He would need to send more birds, gather more information, and perhaps, when the time was right, he would need to reach out to the young Dragon Lord himself. After all, the realm's stability depended on understanding all the players in the game, even the ones who claimed they weren't playing. Back in the Dothraki Sea, Jon Snow stood before his assembled company as the sun set behind them, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. The Black Wolves, as they now called themselves, numbered 28 souls. Not a large force by any measure, but growing stronger and more cohesive with each passing day. "Tomorrow we ride east," he announced, his voice carrying clearly in the still evening air. "There are reports of a slaver caravan 3 days from here, carrying children stolen from the free cities." Murmurs of approval rippled through the ranks. In the weeks since forming the Black Wolves, they had struck at 3 such caravans, freeing dozens of slaves and adding their liberated guards to their number. "Some of you may die," Jon continued, his tone matter-of-fact. "That's the price of the path we've chosen. But those children will live free because of what we do. That has to be enough." As the men dispersed to prepare for the march, Thoros approached with his usual limp. "You've grown into command faster than I expected," the priest observed. "I've had good teachers," Jon replied, stroking Ygritte's neck as the crimson dragon settled on his shoulder. "And good motivation. The men follow you now, without question. That's dangerous for someone so young." Jon's smile was cold as the winds of winter. "Let them follow. I'll give them something worth following." Above them, Balerion circled in the darkening sky, his black scales making him nearly invisible against the stars. Soon, Jon knew, the dragons would be large enough to ride, and when that day came, the world would learn what it meant to face the fury of the Black Wolves. The Age of Dragons had begun again, forged in grief and tempered in the fires of justice, and at its heart was a bastard boy from Winterfell, who had learned that sometimes, to save the innocent, you had to be willing to burn the guilty, even if it meant burning a part of yourself in the process. The port town of Saltshore had seen better days. Once a thriving hub of trade between the free cities and the Dothraki Sea, it now cowered under the rule of Captain Salorcord and his Sunset Reapers, a band of pirates who had claimed the settlement 3 years prior. The legitimate merchants had long since fled or been enslaved, leaving behind only those too poor or too stubborn to abandon their homes. Jon Snow crouched on a ridge overlooking the town, studying the defenses through a spyglass borrowed from Sir Gareth, The Black Wolves had been tracking the Sunset Reapers for a fortnight, following reports of their latest raid on a refugee caravan. What they had found was worse than expected. Not just pirates but slavers who had turned an entire community into their personal hunting ground. 43 fighting men, Jon reported to his assembled lieutenants. Maybe 50. They've got the harbor fortified with stolen ballistae, and they're using the townspeople as human shields. Berian shifted on his shoulder, the black dragon now grown to the size of a small hawk. His crimson sister, Ygritte, perched on Jon's other shoulder, her silver-streaked scales gleaming in the afternoon sun. Both creatures had developed an unsettling intelligence in recent weeks, seeming to understand not just Jon's words but his intentions. A direct assault would be suicide, Ser Gareth observed. The former knight had proven himself a capable tactician in their previous engagements. Those ballistae could punch through armor at this range, and the dragons are still too small to be effective against fortified positions. Not too small, Jon corrected quietly. Just not large enough to do it alone. Thoros of Myr limped up the ridge to join them, his red robes dusty from the ride. The priest had been growing increasingly concerned about Jon's tactical thinking, not because it was flawed, but because it was becoming coldly efficient in ways that reminded him of older, darker legends. "The boy speaks truth," Thoros said, settling beside them with a grunt. "Dragons grow stronger when their rider's will is focused. But remember, Jon, the world loves power until it fears it. Win too decisively, too brutally, and you'll find yourself with enemies instead of allies." Jon's gray eyes never left the town below. The townspeople are already afraid. The question is whether they'll fear us more than they fear their current masters. And if they do, then we'll have to earn their trust another way. Jon's voice carried a cold pragmatism that made Thoros frown. But first, we remove the pirates. The war council that followed revealed the divisions that had been growing within the Black Wolves' leadership. Ser Gareth advocated for a careful siege, starving the pirates out while minimizing civilian casualties. Daemon Rhaegar, the Pentoshi merchant who had joined them after their last victory, argued for negotiation, suggesting they could buy the town's freedom with captured pirate gold. But it was Mira Blackwater, the former slave woman who had become Jon's most trusted advisor on matters of governance, who provided the most sobering perspective. "You speak of minimizing casualties," she said, her accented common tongue carrying the weight of hard experience. "But every day we wait, more townspeople die. The pirates use them for sport when they're bored, for labor when they're not. How many lives is your caution worth?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jon studied each of his advisors in turn, weighing their counsel against his own instincts. At 16, though he looked older after months of hard campaigning, he had learned that leadership meant making choices others couldn't or wouldn't make. "We attack at dawn," he decided, "but not directly. Ser Gareth, take half the men and position them on the eastern approach. Make noise, draw their attention. Daemon, you'll lead a small group to secure the harbor. We need those ships intact for our own use." "And you?" Thoros asked, though he already suspected the answer. Jon's smile was cold as winter wind. "I'm going to give them something to really fear." The attack began before sunrise, with Ser Gareth's diversionary force making enough noise to wake the dead. Horns blared, steel rang against steel, and the pirates rushed to defend what they thought was the main assault. In the confusion, Jon slipped into the town with only Thoros and young Podrick, a former pickpocket who had proven invaluable for reconnaissance. The streets of Salshire were a maze of narrow alleys and crumbling buildings, perfect for someone who knew how to move unseen. Jon had learned such skills during his time with the Black Wolves, adapting the lessons Thoros had taught him about reading people to reading terrain and tactical situations. They reached the town square just as the sun crested the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. Captain Salarkard stood on the steps of what had once been a septa, now converted into his personal throne room. He was a massive man, dark-skinned and scarred, with the kind of casual cruelty that came from years of unchallenged power. "Bring me the heads of these Black Wolves," he roared to his assembled men. "I'll pay 100 gold dragons for the boy who calls himself their leader." "You won't need to pay anything," Jon said, stepping into the square with his dragons perched on his shoulders. "I'm right here." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Pirates who had been shouting orders fell silent. Townspeople who had been cowering in doorways crept forward to get a better look, and Captain Cord's face went pale beneath his weathered tan. Impossible, the pirate captain breathed. Dragons are extinct, have been for 300 years. Apparently not, Jon replied, his voice carrying clearly across the square. Balrion spread his wings in response to his master's calm confidence, while Ygritte released a thin stream of flame that turned a nearby wooden post to ash. The demonstration had its intended effect. Several pirates dropped their weapons and fled, while others looked to their captain for guidance that wasn't coming. Cart stood frozen, caught between disbelief and terror. I'll make you an offer, Jon continued, walking slowly toward the steps. Surrender now, release your captives, and I'll let you and your men leave with your lives. Refuse, and I'll let my dragons show you why your ancestors feared the Valyrian freehold. You're bluffing, Hurd said, but his voice lacked conviction. Those creatures are too small to... His words were cut off as Ygritte took flight, circling the square once before diving toward a group of pirates who had been moving to flank Jon. The Crimson Dragon's flames were precise, surgical. She burned their weapons from their hands without touching their flesh, leaving them screaming and weaponless in the dirt. Size isn't everything, Jon observed mildly. Precision matters more. The psychological effect was devastating. More pirates fled, and even Cord's most loyal followers began to edge away from their captain. But the man himself seemed to find his courage in desperation. Kill him, Cord screamed, drawing his own sword. He's just a boy. Dragons or no dragons, he's just a... Betrayon's response was swift and final. The Black Dragon's flames engulfed the pirate captain completely, reducing him to ash in seconds. The smell of burned flesh filled the square, and several townspeople vomited from the stench. Anyone else want to test my age? Jon asked the remaining pirates. The surrender was immediate and complete. Within an hour, the surviving members of the Sunset Reapers had been disarmed and herded into the town's former jail. An ironic reversal that wasn't lost on the liberated townspeople. Jon stood in the square, accepting the hesitant gratitude of people who weren't sure if they had been rescued or conquered. You did well, Thoros said quietly, approaching with news from the harbor. Daemon secured the ships without a fight, and Sarah Gareth reports minimal casualties among our forces. And the townspeople? Grateful but wary. They've lived under the pirates' boot for 3 years. Trust doesn't come easily to people who've been betrayed before. Jon nodded, understanding the sentiment all too well. Then we'll have to earn it. Mira, what's the town's situation? The former slave woman had been conducting her own survey of Salt Shore's condition. Bad but not hopeless. The pirates have been bleeding the community dry, but the basic infrastructure is intact. The harbor needs repairs, and the people need food. But it could be a proper port again with time and investment. Good, then we're staying. The decision surprised even his closest advisors. Staying, Ser Gareth asked, I thought we were liberators, not conquerors. What's the difference? Jon's question was genuinely curious, rather than rhetorical. We free these people, then ride away and leave them defenseless against the next group of pirates who come along. That's not liberation, that's just changing the timing of their suffering. So you mean to rule them? Daemon asked, his merchant's mind already calculating the implications. I mean to protect them. There's a difference. Over the following days, Jon threw himself into the work of governance with the same focused intensity he had once applied to swordplay. It was harder than he had expected. Ruling required a different kind of strength than fighting, and the decisions he faced had no clear right answers. The question of what to do with the captured pirates proved particularly thorny. The townspeople wanted blood. 3 years of oppression had left them hungry for revenge. But Jon found himself reluctant to simply execute men who had surrendered, even if they deserved it. Justice must be seen to be done, Mira argued, during one of their evening councils. If you show mercy to these men, what message does that send to the next group of pirates who might threaten this place? And if I execute prisoners who surrendered under promise of mercy, what does that say about my word? Jon countered. That you're practical, Sarah Gareth said bluntly. Pirates understand strength, not mercy. Show weakness now, and you'll face 10 times as many enemies later. The debate continued for hours, with each advisor offering their perspective based on their own experiences and beliefs. Jon listened to them all, but in the end, the decision was his alone to make. We'll hold trials, he announced finally. Public ones. Let the townspeople present their grievances. Let the accused defend themselves if they can. Those guilty of murder or rape will hang. The rest will be given a choice, exile or service. Service? Thoros asked. Rebuilding what they helped destroy. The harbor needs repairs, the town needs cleaning, the people need protection while they recover. Let them earn their redemption through honest work. It wasn't a perfect solution. No solution could be, given the circumstances, but it was one that balanced justice with pragmatism. More importantly, it established a precedent for how Jon intended to rule firmly, but fairly, with mercy for those who earned it and steel for those who didn't. The trials took place in the town square over 3 days, with Jon presiding from a simple wooden chair, rather than any kind of throne. The proceedings were brutal in their honesty. Townspeople testified to years of abuse, while the accused pirates offered excuses that ranged from pathetic to enraging. In the end, 7 men were sentenced to death for murder or rape. 12 others chose exile over service, disappearing into the Dothraki Sea with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The remaining 23 accepted Jon's offer of redemption through labor, though their sullen expressions suggested they weren't entirely reconciled to their fate. You realize some of them will try to escape, Daemon pointed out, as they watched the work gangs begin repairs on the harbor. Probably, Jon agreed, but some won't, and those who stay might actually become useful citizens given time. You're gambling with people's lives. I'm gambling with everyone's lives, every day. That's what leadership means. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger, a young woman on a lathered horse, bearing news from the wider world. Jon read the letter she carried with growing interest, then passed it to his advisors. Well, Thoros said after scanning the parchment, it seems word of our activities has spread farther than we thought. The letter was from Magister Illyrio Mopatis of Pentos, offering congratulations on Jon's recent victories and extending an invitation to discuss matters of mutual interest. It was diplomatically worded, but the underlying message was clear. The Free Cities had taken notice of the young Dragon Lord and his growing influence. He wants to use us, Mira said bluntly. Rich men like him don't offer friendship to people like us, unless they see profit in it. Of course he does, Jon replied. The question is whether we can use him in return. That evening, as the sun set over Saltshor's harbor, Jon stood on the town's highest tower, with his dragons perched on his shoulders. Below, he could see the fruits of their labor ships being repaired, buildings being cleaned, people walking the streets without fear for the first time in years. You're building something, Thoros observed, joining him on the tower. Not just winning battles or freeing slaves, but actually building something that might last. I hope so. These people deserve better than what they've had. And what about you? What do you deserve? Jon was quiet for a long moment, watching Balerion and Gigrait play in the evening air. The dragons had grown noticeably in just the past week, and their bond with him had deepened to the point where he could sense their emotions as clearly as his own. I deserve whatever I'm willing to fight for, he said finally. Nothing more, nothing less. The next morning brought another milestone in the Black Wolves' evolution. Jon stood before the assembled townspeople and his own followers, holding a banner that had been sewn overnight by the town's seamstresses. It showed a black direwolf with red eyes on a field of ash and flame, a symbol that combined his Stark heritage with his new identity as a Dragon Lord. This is our banner, he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the square. It represents what we are and what we stand for. We are wolves, pack hunters, who protect our own. We are fire, the flame that burns away corruption and lights the way for those lost in darkness. He raised the banner high, and a cheer went up from the crowd. Not the desperate gratitude of the newly liberated, but something deeper, the kind of loyalty that had to be earned rather than demanded. We are the Black Wolves, Jon continued, and this is our first den, but it won't be our last. Wherever there are chains to be broken, wherever there are tyrants to be toppled, wherever there are innocents who need protection, there we will be. As the crowd dispersed, Jon found himself thinking about the road that had brought him to this moment. 6 months ago, he had been a bastard boy from Winterfell, desperate to prove himself worthy of his father's name. Now he was something else entirely, a leader, a liberator, a force that was already reshaping the political landscape of Western Essos. The transformation hadn't come without cost. He could feel the coldness in his heart growing stronger with each hard decision, each necessary compromise. But perhaps that was the price of power, to save others. You had to be willing to sacrifice pieces of yourself. Meanwhile, in Winterfell, Eddard Stark stood in his solar, staring at a map of Essos that he had commissioned from the Citadel. Red pins marked the locations where his son had been reported, a trail of liberation and conquest that stretched from Pentos to the Dothraki Sea. He's building something, Ned murmured to himself, tracing the path with his finger. Not just fighting, but actually building. The latest reports spoke of Jon establishing a permanent base in some minor port town, of trials and governance, and the kind of systematic approach to rulership that suggested long-term thinking. It was both encouraging and terrifying. Encouraging because it showed the boy had learned the lessons Ned had tried to teach him. Terrifying because those lessons were being applied on a scale that could reshape the world. "My lord?" Maester Luwin's voice came from the doorway. "You sent for me?" "Yes. I need you to send a raven to King's Landing. Tell them I need to speak with Robert about matters concerning the Free Cities." "Of course, my lord. Might I ask what this concerns?" Ned was quiet for a long moment, still staring at the map. "Family business, Luwin. Just family business." In King's Landing, Tyrion Lannister sat in his favorite brothel, a cup of Dornish red in one hand and a book of Usse history in the other. He had been following the reports of the young Dragon Lord with professional interest, partly because such developments could affect trade, but mostly because he found the whole situation fascinating from an intellectual standpoint. Dragons, he mused to Bronn, who was examining the quality of the establishment's wine with critical attention. After 3 centuries, dragons returned to the world in the hands of Ned Stark's bastard. If that's not irony, I don't know what is.
Irony doesn't pay the bills, Bronn replied pragmatically. What does this mean for us?
Probably nothing. In the short term, the boy's focused on Essos for now, and he's got enough enemies there to keep him busy for years. But in the long term, Tyrion took a thoughtful sip of wine. Well, let's just say I'm glad I'm not in charge of the realm's foreign policy. You think he'll come west? Eventually, power has its own momentum. It either grows or it dies, and from what I've heard, young Jon Snow has no intention of dying. Tyrion raised his cup in a mock toast. To the bastard of Winterfell, who may yet prove that blood matters less than will, may he find what he's looking for, and may the rest of us survive the finding. Back in Saltshore, Jon Snow stood on his tower as night fell over his small domain. The dragons roosted beside him, their presence a warm comfort against the evening chill. Below, the town was settling into its new routine. Guards walking their beats, merchants preparing for tomorrow's trade, families gathering for evening meals without fear of pirate raids. It wasn't much, in the grand scheme of things. One small port town, barely 2,000 souls, defended by a company of sellswords and 2 dragons that were still more potential than actuality. But it was a beginning. "What are you thinking about?" Mira asked, joining him on the tower. "The future," Jon replied. "What we're building here, what it might become." "And what do you see?" Jon was quiet for a moment, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "I see a place where people can live without fear, where justice isn't just for those who can afford it, where the strong protect the weak instead of preying on them. That's a beautiful dream. Dreams are just plans you haven't figured out how to implement yet." Jon's smile was sharp as a blade. "And I'm very good at making plans." As if in response to his words, Berion lifted his head and released a small gout of flame into the night sky. Not a threat, but a promise. The Age of Dragons had begun again, and this time it would be different. This time, it would be better. It had to be. The raven arrived at dawn, its black wings cutting through the morning mist that clung to Saltshore's harbor. Jon Snow stood on the battlements of what had once been Captain Cord's stronghold, now serving as the seat of his growing power. The bird landed on his outstretched arm, with practiced ease, one of many he had trained to carry messages across the increasingly complex web of his influence. The letter it bore was written in the flowing script of the Free Cities, sealed with unfamiliar wax. Jon broke it open and read, his expression growing darker with each line. "Bad news?" Thoros of Myr asked, approaching with his characteristic limp. The Red Priest had been watching Jon with growing concern these past weeks, noting how the young man now had begun to carry himself with the unconscious authority of born rulers. "The Golden Company has taken a contract," Jon replied, handing over the letter. 50,000 gold dragons to remove the pretender Dragon Lord from Saltshore and deliver his head to Lys. Thoros read quickly, his weathered face grim. "The Golden Company, 20,000 swords, seasoned veterans all. This is no mere sword band. Jon, these are professionals. I know what they are. Jon's voice carried a coldness that made even the dragons on his shoulders shift restlessly. Targaryen, and he gritted, had grown considerably in recent weeks. Now the size of small eagles, their intelligence sharp enough to sense their master's moods. The question is, what we do about it. We could run, Gareth Blackwater suggested, joining them on the battlements. The former knight had been conducting the morning watch, and his armor still bore the dew of early patrol. Pack up, take the ships, find another port to liberate. There's no shame in avoiding a fight you can't win. And abandon these people? Mira Blackwater's voice cut across the conversation like a blade. The former slave had become Jon's most trusted advisor on matters of governance, and her moral compass often served as his conscience. We promised them protection, we gave them our word. Pretty words won't stop 20,000 swords, Gareth replied. Though his tone lacked conviction, he had grown fond of Salt Shore's people in the months since their liberation. Jon studied the letter again, his mind racing through possibilities. The Golden Company was indeed formidable, disciplined, well-equipped, and led by commanders who had never known defeat. But they were also expensive, which meant their employer had deep pockets and serious motivation. Who hired them? He asked aloud. The letter doesn't say, Thoros replied, but given the price and the target, I'd guess one of the major slaving houses. Probably from Lice or Myr. They've lost considerable profits since you started liberating their merchandise. Then this was always inevitable. Jon's smile was sharp as winter steel. We've been too successful. Someone was bound to take notice. The war council that followed revealed the stark reality of their situation. The Black Wolves had grown to nearly 300 swords, a respectable force for a mercenary company, but laughably small against the Golden Company's might. Their advantages were few. The dragons, the defensive position of Saltshore, and the loyalty of the townspeople. We need allies, Damon the Pentoshi merchant argued. He had proven invaluable in establishing trade relationships with the smaller free cities, and his network of contacts stretched across western Essos. There are other mercenary companies who might be willing to join us for the right price. With what coin? Ser Gareth asked bluntly. We've been giving away more gold than we've been taking in. Our treasury won't support hiring additional swords. Then we don't hire them, Jon said quietly. We convince them. The room fell silent. In the months since establishing their hold on Saltshore, Jon had shown a talent for inspiring loyalty that went beyond mere payment. But convincing hardened sellswords to fight the Golden Company without promise of gold was another matter entirely. How? Mira asked. Jon stood and walked to the great map that dominated one wall of the chamber, a detailed rendering of Western Essos that showed the locations of various mercenary companies, slaving operations, and free cities. Red pins marked their victories, black pins their enemies, and white pins potential allies. We offer them something more valuable than coin, he said, placing his finger on a cluster of white pins near the disputed lands. We offer them purpose. Meanwhile, in King's Landing, Lord Varys glided through the secret passages beneath the Red Keep, his soft shoes making no sound on the ancient stones. In his hands he carried a collection of reports that had arrived throughout the night, whispers from across the narrow sea that spoke of dragons and fire, of a bastard boy who had begun to reshape the political landscape of Essos. The Spider's chambers were a testament to his craft. Maps covered every wall, marked with the movements of armies and the schemes of princes. But it was the newest edition that drew his attention, a detailed rendering of Saltshore and its surroundings, annotated with intelligence gathered from his little birds. Jon Snow, he murmured to himself, studying a rough portrait based on eyewitness accounts. Ned Stark's bastard, now calling himself the Wolf of Fire. How very unexpected. The reports painted a picture of rapid transformation. The boy who had left Winterfell as a priest's squire had become something far more dangerous, a leader who combined Stark honor with Targaryen fire, tempering both with a pragmatism that suggested he had learned hard lessons about the nature of power. More concerning were the reports of his growing abilities. The dragons were one thing, dangerous, but still small enough to be manageable. But the whispers of fire magic, of flames that danced at his command, suggested bloodline gifts that had been dormant for centuries. The realm is not ready for another dragon lord, Varys whispered to the shadows. But ready or not, one rises in the east. He would need to send more birds, gather more intelligence, and perhaps when the time was right, he would need to consider more direct action. The Game of Thrones had enough players already, Adding dragons to the board could upset everything he had worked to achieve. In Winterfell, Eddard Stark stood in the Godswood, his hand resting on the rough bark of the heart tree. The face carved into the weirwood seemed to watch him with ancient eyes, and Ned found himself wondering, not for the first time, what the old gods thought of the path his bastard son had chosen. "Father?" Arya's voice came from behind him, soft but curious. At 9 years old, she was already showing signs of the wolf blood that ran strong in the Stark line. "You've been coming here every day since the ravens started arriving." Ned turned to face his daughter, noting how she moved with the unconscious grace of a natural fighter. Serio Forel's lessons were serving her well, though he suspected she was learning more than just swordplay from the Bravasi water dancer. "I've been thinking about your brother," he admitted. "Which one?" "Rob's been training with the Master-at-Arms. Bran's been climbing again despite Jon." Arya's expression grew serious. She had always been closest to Jon among her siblings, sharing his outsider status in different ways. "The letters say he has dragons now. Is that true?" Ned was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "The reports suggest it's possible. Your brother has always been special. Will he come home?" The question cut to the heart of Ned's fears. Would Jon return to Westeros? And if he did, what would that mean for the realm? Robert's hatred of Targaryens was well known, and dragons would only inflame those old wounds. "I don't know, little one. I hope so, but the path he's chosen may not lead back to Winterfell." Arya was quiet for a moment, then asked the question that had been haunting Ned's dreams. "Is he still our Jon, or has he become something else?" Ned had no answer for that. The report spoke of a young man who combined mercy with ruthlessness, who could inspire loyalty in freed slaves and terror in enemies. It sounded like Jon, but also like someone else entirely. "I suppose we'll find out," he said finally. Back in Saltshore, Jon stood before a gathering, unlike any seen in the Free Cities for generations. Representatives from a dozen mercenary companies had answered his call. Not the great powers like the Golden Company or the Second Sons, but smaller bands of exiles and outcasts who survived on the margins of the sellsword trade. There was Captain Davin Blackwater of the Burned Men, scarred veterans of the disputed lands who had been driven from their homes by licensed slavers. Beside him stood a fierce woman, a former Silent Sister, who now led a company of warrior women called the Maidens of Steel. In the back, nearly invisible in the shadows, lurked representatives of the Faceless Company, deserters from various armies, who had banded together for mutual protection. "You all know why you're here," Jon began, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "The Golden Company has been hired to destroy what we've built in Saltzar. They offer no quarter, no mercy, only death for those who stand against them." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The Golden Company's reputation was well known, and many of these smaller companies had lost friends to their discipline deficiency. "I could offer you gold to stand with us," Jon continued. "But gold runs out. I could promise you easy victory, but we all know that would be a lie. Instead, I offer you something more valuable, the chance to be part of something that matters." He gestured to the town below, where former slaves worked alongside freed pirates to repair the harbor. "Look at what we've accomplished here. A place where strength protects the weak instead of preying on them. Where justice isn't just for those who can afford it. Where people can build lives without fear." Captain Blackwater stepped forward, his scarred face skeptical. "Pretty words, boy, but the Golden Company doesn't care about your noble intentions. They'll burn this place to ash and sell the survivors to the highest bidder." "Then we stop them," Jon replied simply. "Not for gold, not for glory, but because it's right. And if we die in the attempt," Jon's smile was cold as the winds of winter, "then we die knowing we stood for something worth dying for." How many sellswords can say the same? The debate that followed was fierce and honest. These were men and women who had learned hard lessons about the cost of idealism, who had seen too many noble causes end in blood and betrayal. But there was something in Jon's words, or perhaps in the way the dragons perched calmly on his shoulders, that gave them pause. "What exactly are you proposing?" the lady asked. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to command, and her steel-gray eyes missed nothing. "An alliance," Jon replied. "Not just for this battle, but for what comes after. The free cities are built on slavery and exploitation. The Dothraki raid and pillage without consequence. The sellsword companies fight for whoever pays the most, regardless of the cause. We can change that. How? By offering an alternative, a confederation of free companies, bound not by gold, but by shared principles. We protect the innocent. We fight tyranny wherever we find it, and we build something better than what came before. The silence that followed was deafening. Jon had essentially proposed remaking the entire power structure of Western Essos, a task that would require not just military might but political genius and incredible luck. "You're talking about revolution," Captain Blackwater said finally. "I'm talking about evolution," Jon corrected. "The world is changing whether we guide it or not. The question is whether we shape that change or let it shape us." One by one, the company representatives began to nod. Not all of them. 3 groups departed that very night, unwilling to risk their necks for such an uncertain cause. But enough remained to give Jon hope. "The burned men stand with Salt Shore," Captain Blackwater declared. "As do the Maidens of Steel," a woman added. The faceless company's representatives simply nodded. They were not given to speeches. By dawn, Jon had secured commitments from 8 mercenary companies, adding nearly 2,000 swords to his cause. It was still not enough to match the Golden Company in open battle, but it was a start. In Pentos, Magister Ilio Mopatis sat in his garden, sampling exotic fruits, while reading the latest reports from his agents in Salt Shore. The fat merchant's face was thoughtful as he considered the implications of what he was learning. "Fascinating," he murmured to his companion. A thin, sharp-featured man whose identity was known only to a select few. "The boy grows more interesting by the day." "Interesting enough to be useful?" his guest asked. "Perhaps. He has the bloodline. Certainly, and the dragons are undeniably real. But his ideology?" Illyrio shook his head. "He speaks of justice and liberation. Such idealism can be useful, but it can also be dangerous." "Dangerous to whom?" "To anyone who profits from the current order, which includes most of the people we need to keep happy." Illyrio selected a particularly ripe peach and bit into it thoughtfully. "Still, he bears watching. Power has its own momentum, and this boy has more power than he realizes. Should we make contact?" "Not yet. Let him face the Golden Company first. If he survives, then we'll know he's worth our attention. If he doesn't," Illyrio shrugged, "then the problem solves itself." That evening, Jon stood alone in his chambers, practicing the fire magic that had been growing stronger with each passing day. He held his hand palm up, concentrating on the warmth that lived in his blood, and slowly a flame began to dance above his skin. It was beautiful and terrible, a piece of dragon fire made manifest through will alone. The flame didn't burn him, responding to his thoughts like a trained animal. But the effort left him drained, and he could feel the cold that lived in his heart, growing stronger in response. "You're pushing yourself too hard," Thoros said from the doorway. The Red Priest had been watching Jon's magical development with growing concern. "The Golden Company will be here within a fortnight," Jon replied, letting the flame die. "I need every advantage I can find. Fire magic is not a tool to be mastered overnight. It takes years of study, decades of practice. Push too hard, too fast, and you risk burning yourself out. Literally." Jon turned to face his old mentor, noting the worry in the priest's eyes. "You think I'm walking a dangerous path? I think you're walking a king's path, lad, and kings burn bright, but they burn fast." Thoros limped into the room, settling into a chair with a grunt. "I've served kings before. Good ones and bad ones. They all shared one trait. They believed their cause justified any cost. And you think I'm becoming like them? I think you're becoming something new. Whether that's better or worse remains to be seen." Jon was quiet for a moment, considering the priest's words. "The people of Salt Shore trust me to protect them. The companies that joined us trust me to lead them. I can't afford to be weak. Strength and ruthlessness aren't the same thing, Jon. Your father understood that. My father never had dragons. He never faced the Golden Company with the lives of thousands in his hands." Jon's voice carried an edge that made Thoros frown. "The world is harder than he taught me. Sometimes you have to choose between being good and being effective. And which do you choose?" Jon's smile was cold as winter wind. "I choose to win, everything else is secondary." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Mira entered, her face grim with news. "The Golden Company has been sighted," she reported. 3 days' march to the east. They're moving faster than expected. Jon nodded, the familiar coldness settling over him like armor. Send word to all company commanders. We meet at dawn to finalize our battle plans. As Myr departed, Thoros studied Jon's face in the flickering candlelight. The boy he had taken as a squire was gone, replaced by someone harder, more calculating. The transformation had been gradual, but now it was complete. What have I helped create? The priest whispered to himself. Jon heard the words but didn't respond. He was already thinking ahead to the battle to come, weighing strategies and calculating odds. The Golden Company was formidable, but they had weaknesses: overconfidence, rigid tactics, a reliance on reputation that might not survive contact with dragons. For the first time since receiving news of their approach, Jon smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. Let them come, he said quietly. Let them see what it means to face the wolf of fire. Outside his window, the dragons roosted on the tower's edge, their eyes reflecting the starlight like jewels. They had grown again, now the size of hunting hawks, with wingspans that could cast shadows across a man's body. Soon they would be large enough to carry riders, and when that day came, the balance of power in Essos would shift forever. But first they had to survive the Golden Company, and Jon was beginning to realize that survival might require sacrifices he wasn't sure he was ready to make. The weight of command settled on his shoulders like a cloak, heavy with responsibility and dark with necessity. For the first time in his life, Jon Snow truly understood what it meant to hold the lives of others in his hands. And despite everything, the fear, the doubt, the growing coldness in his heart, he found that he liked it. The realization should have disturbed him more than it did.